Welcome to the Lawyering Peace podcast series, where we explore the art of diplomacy, the practice of peace building, and the legal and policy frameworks that shape the global order. Today, I am very excited to welcome my good friend, Berhanemeskel Nega, onto the podcast. Berhanemeskel, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's good to be back. Thank you.
Great. And for our listeners, I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Now, today's episode continues our exploration of paradigm shifts in the international system. We will discuss how global governance is evolving and how practitioners and diplomats are adapting to increasingly complex and regionalized conflicts. Berhanemeskel brings more than 35 years of experience in multilateral diplomacy, peacekeeping, mediation, and post-conflict peace building. And in fact, I think we first met in Juba when when you were with the UNIMED and helping to advise on the Juba peace process relating to the conflict in Sudan. So when we both had our briefcases on the ground, was the first time we got together. For the benefit of our audience, a little more on the bio, Berhanemeskel served as the Director of Political Affairs and the head of the office for UNIMED, the United Nations African Union Hybrid Mission in Darfur, where he played a central role in supporting both the Juba and the Doha peace processes. Over the course of his distinguished career, he has also served as the Chief of Staff for the United Nations Peacebuilding Mission in Guinea-Bissau, and as the Chief of Staff and Deputy Head of the UN Mission in Sierra Leone, and as a senior diplomat in Ethiopia, including as a representative to the United Nations. He's also a senior peace fellow with the Public International Law and Policy Group. His career reflects a rare combination of regional expertise, institutional leadership, and deep engagement with the evolving architecture of multilateral peace operations. Berhanemeskel, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much again, Paul, and it has been a pleasure and an honor.
Let's kick it off with your origin story. When did you decide that you wanted to be a diplomat, that you wanted to be engaged in foreign affairs? Do you trace this back to your childhood or middle school, or were you planning on being something else and woke up one day and thought, you know what, I should be a diplomat. I can really have an impact as a diplomat.
Thank you very much, Paul, once again for the introduction. This one is a bit long story anyway, but we don't have much time for it. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, very interesting times, where we had hopes and upheavals in the international system. And growing at those times, I observed many African nations getting their independence, and Ethiopia was very active in the international scene and African politics also. The whole news we get on the radios and the TV were just starting. It was a really fascinating time. So I was following all those developments as a young man, but Ethiopia also was not spared from that whole scenario in 1974, where the emperor was overthrown, where we had a military government, a military junta, which declared socialism in Ethiopia, and all that happening. That was which we grew up observing in the 60s and 70s, including, by the way, United Nations Security Council meeting, the first meeting, major meeting out of its UNHQ headquarters in New York, was held in Addis Ababa in 1972, all that coming in the news. So that developed truly, really my interest in history, political science, and international law, which I pursued. And then it was more of a luck, frankly, not intentional, sort of, that I joined the foreign ministry, ended up in a department which deals with international organizations, multilateralism, back some 40 years back. So that's all really my career and how I joined the UN and served in New York and in what I call really the golden age of multilateralism, the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, where I was really fortunate to serve in the Sixth Committee and in the International Security Committee as well. And we saw really great progress in the codification and development of progressive development of international law. You know, how many conventions were adopted in the 90s, just in half a century, 6 of them, at least the major ones, and the ICC and all those. And then after I left the government service, joined the UN and in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone was quite really also interesting experience. So that's how really things came about. It's a combination of interest as well as luck, and which I enjoyed up to this time, being part of that. Thank you.
Berhanemeskel, it sounds like you've been at so many inflections in the global order. Many commentators will argue that we're now entering a new age, a paradigm shift, and there's lots of different ideas about what this paradigm shift looks like and what it should look like. I'm curious for your thoughts. Are we overreacting, and this is just another evolution of the international order? Or is this a fairly dramatic paradigm shift? And what are your thoughts on the nature of this paradigm shift, if you think there is one?
Oh, yes, I think this is very, very important question. And of course, there are discussions and there are different schools of thought, whether this is a new sudden rupture or a complete change or something which is evolutionary, which is really something which we should have expected to happen. And going back, if you see the evolution of um, the global order, in a way, especially the post-World War II system, which was built on the will and the desires of the victors of the war. But yet it tried to bring certain elements of democratization of international relations, in a sense, certain elements. But overall, which ended up to be a bipolar world, which we had from 1941 to 1991, in a sense, where we had the United States on one side leading the West and the Soviet Union on the other hand leading the Eastern Bloc. That was what what we had for a long period of time. Also in the middle, in the 70s, mid-70s, where we had a transition to a new form of order, global order, especially after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and of course, the stagnation of the socialist order, where we have upheavals in different countries in the Eastern world, like in Poland and Czechoslovakia, all those. That period was a gradual shift, which resulted at the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and then a brief period of unipolarism where the US was really the dominating power in the world. That's what I call the 90s, where I had the privilege of serving in the UN at that time. And also before that, during the Cold War, I had an opportunity also to serve, but coming from New York, of course, not as permanent diplomat in New York. So comparing the two, in the 90s, where we saw that really very collaborative spirit in the international system, where the UN was functioning and decisions, even at the Security Council, were made relatively with consensus, with agreements. And then the 90s, which we saw that unipolar world, of course, did not last long. Again, we had a shift, a transition. I think I see the defining moment of that transition of 9/11 anyway. There are some who say it's 2003 after the Iraq invasion. Even some attribute that transition to a multipolar order, the 2008 economic crisis, the global financial crisis, all that. But I see more of the 9/11 episode, that the whole setup being started changing, and the ascendance of China, of course, with the economic crisis. So what I'm trying to say is this was something going on, a kind of evolutionary historical shifts from time to time. And where we are now is obviously a transition to a multipolarism, multipolar global order for various reasons now. So this is happening, of course, this is real now, but it doesn't mean a complete abandonment of the institutions and the legal frameworks which were built over the past 80 years, the post-Cold War, which especially those who kept the system and the world together. For example, what we call the Hughes Cogans or peremptory norms of international law, prohibition of aggression, prohibition of genocide, respect for international humanitarian law, prohibition of slavery, all those kind of fundamental rules of law which need to be continued. At the same time, of course, there should be adjustment, adaptation at all levels, at the institutional level and normative level as well, where clearly you cannot deal with 21st century challenges with the 20th century norms. There will be adaptation, there will be change, but it's not a complete abandonment of those basic fundamental principles which kept the world relatively peaceful somehow and prosperous.
Well, Berhanemeskel, one of the norms or institutions that kept the world peaceful to a degree were peacekeeping, United Nations peacekeeping forces, and sometimes regional peacekeeping forces. Can you give us a little bit of a sense, given the deep engagement you had with UNIMID and other peacekeeping forces, how these peace operations have evolved over the last 10 or 20 years and how they're evolving in the last 1 or 2 years? And what do you see as the future of UN or other peacekeeping operations? At the moment, people are thinking about the need for a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, plus security guarantees, peacekeeping force in Sudan, again, also possibly again, South Sudan, so many other places around the globe. There's an identification of a need for peacekeeping forces. Is it going to be different, or is this the nature of peacekeeping is quite resilient and won't be impacted by this paradigm shift in the global order? What are your thoughts?
Yes, again, if we confine ourselves to the recent times, 2 years or 3 years, which we have seen dramatic changes in the peacekeeping and peacebuilding engagements, United Nations engagement. But going back a bit to early times, I think if you see the 90s, where I said the golden ages probably in multilateralism, the Cold War period, it was very easy for the Security Council to take action whenever. That's when we had the most of the peacekeeping missions approved by the Security Council, including Sierra Leone, the Balkans, and you name it, most of the important, the largest peacekeeping missions. Since we have been again observing a gradual shift from relying on peacekeeping missions. One relevant example is Darfur, UNAMID, where I served and where we met also with you. That was when, in I think some probably 10 years back, where there was a pushback against that mission, first time by Sudan, by the government, but by those who matter in the Security Council as well, and across the board in other missions as well, in DRC or Mali or all that. So the past 10 years were what we witnessed was a progressive move away from United Nations peacekeeping engagements in a way. So that was what we have been seeing. And as a result of what we have been observing in terms of the Security Council P5 members, competition or differences in a sense. The paralysis, of course, has been ongoing, and it has now reached to a point where even under situations of the gravest humanitarian crisis, like what we're witnessing in Darfur again, the second round of genocide. There was no hope for the UN and the international community to act because of the Russian veto, as we know. The same happens also with regard to other crisis situations. So that is where we are. I think the UN peacekeeping operations are now the victims of that new transition, if we call it, or rupture, a new shift in the global order or by the multilateral system. So that's what we see. Hopefully, I think there is still one recent development which drew my attention, especially the Iran war. We have seen it as going on as a unilateral action by the US and Israel and so on. But there was a pivot at the end, going back to the UN Security Council, not to, of course, seek a peacekeeping mission, but at least to resort back to the UN and see how conflicts can be managed. So maybe there is hope in the future. And I see it, I think, as the only way forward, what we knew as working, since unilateralism fails all the time, whether Russia's aggression in Ukraine or the Iran war or other unilateral actions. I think there will be probably a return back to UN peacekeeping or multilateral actions, but not in the current or past forms. There will be adaptations, there will be changes, there should be reforms in a way which were long overdue, which we have been talking about with you as well when we discussed Paul last time, UNAMID, what the problems, the challenges we were facing at that time as well.
Well, Berhanemeskel, that's an interesting observation. As the consequences of unilateralism or unipolarity become more apparent, there has, as you say, been this flirtation with the multilateral mechanisms that have been, to a degree, abandoned. There's also a narrative, both in the peace operations, but also more broadly in peace and security negotiations, economic stability, that regional entities may fill the void of instead of multilateralism, minilateralism or regionalism. The European Union, if it can ever figure out which direction it wants to go, could play a substantial role as a regional entity operating on the global scale, not only just in Europe. ASEAN also, there's some hopes for ASEAN. The African Union, what are your thoughts on the ability of the African Union, which recently, a number of years ago, created its own peace and security council, which has the capability for peacekeeping? And as we've discussed, you were the political director for the UNAU mission in Darfur, and on an earlier podcast episode, shared your thoughts and your concerns about how that operated. But what should we be thinking about, hoping for, but aware of when we think about the African Union taking on a larger role in peace and security on the African continent?
Of course, the primary responsibility for international peace and security rests with the Security Council, with the United Nations, and also always regional organizations, including the AU and previously the OAU, have a role to play, a complementary role in accordance with Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. And it's clear in the Charter to what extent regional organizations can participate, can play a role. And the AU, since its transformation from OAU to AU, has been more active in the area of peace and security, and clearly in its Constituent Act of 2000, Article 4, was very clear that it will engage in the maintenance of regional peace and security in Africa in situations of grave human rights violations, genocide here and there and all that. And the first test was Darfur. Of course, it tried in Burundi as well, Somalia, in different countries. I think the normative framework is there. The desire is there. But so far, we haven't seen, AU having developed that capacity and doing things on its own independently somehow. Of course, the most important factor is the political will to take difficult decisions. We have seen it in Sudan, where the AU was more trying to accommodate the Bashir government than taking that opportunity for the first time presented to it to make a difference in Africa, working together with the United Nations. So I think this is a mixed bag somehow. There is the desire, there is the normative, whatever framework, but it requires more than that. It requires more than that. Still, we have almost more than half of the conflicts in the world are African conflicts. We have the worst humanitarian crisis going on in Sudan, even in the very host country of the AU, Ethiopia. We have conflicts raging. Just in 2 years in the Tigray conflict, over about 1 million people were killed. And still we have conflicts in different parts of Ethiopia, in Amhara, in Oromia, and grave humanitarian crisis we see across the board in the region, in the continent, on the continent, from Sahel to East Africa and the Horn. So, there is a lot which has to be done by AU, by the regional organization, to address these challenges effectively. But the potential is there. It's just how to take advantage of the situation which is presented.
Berhanemeskel, let's pick up on that. The African states, the African continent, taking advantage of the situation that's being presented at the moment with the paradigm shift. And I want to bundle three questions together. One is, what do you see as important shifts taking place across the African continent? In West Africa, there was a movement away from the UN and the French to the Russians and the Wagner Group. There were a number of coups in the ECOWAS, sort of a retrenchment of democracy. That was one shift. There's also some pretty impressive economic shifts occurring throughout, in a positive way, the African continent. The second is Africa itself has big, middle, and small powers. We oftentimes like to talk about the global community. There's the superpowers, and there's the middle powers, and then there's oftentimes they'll say the global south or small powers. But Africa has its own dynamic. Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Egypt, and a couple of others are the big powers, and then middle and small. How is that relationship shaping up? And then how is Africa positioning itself in this global paradigm shift to take advantage of it, to secure its place in this paradigm shift, and also to guard against being left behind? I was struck by Prime Minister Carney's presentation at Davos. He was all about the middle powers. He was not interested in the little powers. It was, let's get a bunch of middle powers together so we can offset the Americans and the Chinese, ignoring the rest of the globe. So how's Africa positioning itself?
Yeah, again, I think, Paul, Africa, when you see Africa, Africa is it's changing in a sense. It has changed. It's a continent of 1.4 billion people, which will double by 2050 to almost 2.5 billion. And it has great potentials. Almost more than 30% of the global natural resources, critical resources are in Africa. It has a huge population with great potentials. So as the continent is, of course, is transforming somehow with all those elements which you mentioned earlier. We see different trends in different parts of the continent, from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa and Southern Africa, all that. So those are, again, both challenges and opportunities in a way for the continent. In the Sahel now, military coups, which are ironically popular by people, you see, but unable to bring any dividends in terms of peace or prosperity as well. So there should be a kind of a solution to those as well. Again, you will see in the Horn of Africa, another very much important part of the continent, a strategic part of the continent, where you see almost all the countries in that region still going through devastating conflicts like Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, all those. But if they can manage those conflicts, those countries can have also great potentials to develop and to bring peace to their people. So it's a kind of a dilemma, a mixed bag, which in Africa, which has an opportunity with all its potentials to play a role in this shift in the global order, I think. But the first thing, in my view, what can really matter is for these countries individually and for the continent, the most important situation is to resolve their conflicts, internal conflicts. Divided nations, weak nations, and unstable nations cannot really be a player at the global and regional stage. So the first and foremost, what I see is the internal stability of those nations, which should be given priority. And we don't see much in that sense as well. And here comes also the role of the United Nations and the international community, especially the AU, in supporting those nations to deal with their internal conflicts, internal problems. So that's where we are. I think for me, having being part of the whole, as in Sudan or in different countries, observing the conflicts, what we see the trend now is we are witnessing more conflicts than ever. We have to put our houses in order before opting for playing a role at the global or regional level. That's how I see it. That's where we are.
Let's pick up on that because as may the big, middle, and small powers in Africa try to get their internal houses in order so that they can have more of an impact on the global stage or steer this paradigm shift, they're also subject to a different type of strategic competition among the big players in a multipolar world, the Americans, the Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans as well, including explicitly the French, used to all engage in a power play, pick any part of the globe, they'd be engaged in a power play in Africa, particularly with critical minerals and rare earths and oil and gas and others. But they have sharper elbows now. The Americans are more explicitly, look, pick a side, us or the Chinese. The Europeans are coming into their own, some might say, and developing some sharp elbows as well, vis-a-vis the Americans and also vis-a-vis the Chinese. The Russians, it's mostly military. But how is this playing out? This new dynamic of a sharper elbow, a great power competition. It's always been there, so we don't want to be naive about this, but it's a little more aggressive than it has been in the past. Can you walk us through the implications of that for the future of Africa?
Yeah, as you said, the great power competition in Africa has been there, and this is part of really the African politics for a long time. But now it's changing. The situation is changing, the players and the means they employ, and also the arrival of new actors. It's not just the big powers like the US or China or Russia or Europe, but also the Gulf countries, Turkey, and to some extent, Iran was a player in some of the countries around there. You have this multiplication of the external actors trying to play a role or have influence in Africa. And at the same time, the means they employ to advance their interests on the continent, in the countries. So the challenge, again, for African countries now and is, I think, the more they are divided internally, I think the more they will be exposed to external interference. As we see now in Sudan, on the side of who are on the side of the RSF and SAF. If you see, RSF is supported by the United Arab Emirates, providing all sorts of support, and the SAF by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt in a way. So how is Sudan coming out of this situation and assert its interest, and even beyond that, be a player in this new dynamics in the global order? Is first and foremost, I think, for the Sudanese to come together to realize they are the only ones who can solve their problem and save their own country. So that's why I emphasize, I really, what would be most important and the priority for these countries is to put their houses, to solve their problems. And I think blaming external actors all the time, and shifting the blame won't probably help. There may be some truth into it. Of course, it has impact, but not the main one is to resolve their own problem. If you see now the big powers like the US, China, again, they are using different means. The Chinese have established very solid presence in many of the African countries using their own economic and trade and other means. The US, more of the alignment or interest was so far security oriented. But now we see more of the minerals and other aspects of more of a transactional approach. We see the Russians are more of selling weapons and transactional, using this African core, or whatever they call it, especially in the Sahel area. I think at the end of the day, the Africans have to come to their own means to advance their interests. And they can do that only if they work together as Africans, first and foremost, and solve their own problems. That's where we see, I think it's a bit complex environment the Africans are put. Again, unlike the post-Second World War paradigm shift, this one, they have an opportunity to have a say in framing this new order. If first and foremost they deal with their own problems, they work on their institutions like the AU, play a more meaningful role. But again, I think the opportunities are there, the potential is there, but they have to do it in a manner that would be first and foremost. That I keep repeating this, Paul, I think because the internal crises in these countries, in most of the African countries, as I said, half of the conflicts in the world are currently in Africa. And unless they solve their problem, no one can solve it for them in a way.
Well, Berhanemeskel, let's then talk a little bit about Ethiopia, because I think it's in exactly this position that you're describing. Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, is the headquarters of the African Union. For the longest time, Ethiopia, paired with Kenya, were seen as cornerstones of East Africa, the Horn of Africa. They participated in peacekeeping forces. They were bastions of stability. But as you mentioned, in Ethiopia with the Tigray, first with the Eritrea separation, and then the conflict with Eritrea, then the conflict with Tigray, and now the conflict with Amara and the Oromans and others. What's happening in Ethiopia? And is it losing its ability to be an anchor of stability in Africa? And what do you see unfolding in the coming years for Ethiopia? And why? Why has this happened?
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, Ethiopia was the anchor of stability in the region and played important role in international peace and security and peacekeeping, starting from the Korean War, the Congo First Mission, and so forth. And historically, Ethiopia was one of the four African countries, members of the League of Nations, and the founder of the UN, one of the founders of the UN from Africa, the four countries again, the OAU and the non-aligned. So it played a significant role in the global discourse in international relations for many years until 1974 again, until we had the socialist military junta take over. And since then, for the last 50 years, Ethiopia's really move was downwards in a way because of the internal situation again, which impacted on its regional and international standing. That's where we are, especially the last 8 years since 2018. That trend has reached to a point of existential threat to the country's even survival or continuing as a nation. It is a country of 130 million people, the second most populous country in Africa. You can imagine what would be the impact, the consequence of Ethiopia's collapse or disintegration further. So we're having serious issues when it comes to Ethiopia now. And the problem which Ethiopia has, again, is systemic, which fundamentally divided the people into different regions, what is called ethnic federalism. You have millions of armed people in Ethiopia, different armed groups you have. In each 11 or 12 regions, they have their own security apparatus. And the constitution grants each and every region to secede, to declare independence anytime. So that is the whole root cause of the problem, which Ethiopia, which at a point in history was known for regional and international stability, is now unable even to maintain its own peace and stability. That's where things stand in Ethiopia. I've been repeating this again. If Ethiopia manages to solve its internal problems, internal crises, which are very much existential, it can continue. It has the potential to go back to its historical role in terms of promoting African and international peace and security. But now what we see now is more of Ethiopia needs to be rescued somehow. And the collapse, the failure of Ethiopia would be disastrous for the region, especially for the Horn of Africa, where you have instability across the board, whether in Somalia or Sudan, in other places, South Sudan.
Do you see any signs of hope, optimism in Ethiopia at the moment? What would a optimistic pathway look like to peace in Ethiopia?
Yeah, we have to be optimist. There is no other way, because failure will be disastrous, not just only for Ethiopia, but also for the region in a way. The hope is again for Ethiopia and for the region is how these different components of the Ethiopian state, the regions, the people in there, how they can come together and engage in genuine dialogue somehow to people. Because in the 1990s, when this ethnic federation was set up, the leading force was the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And as such, the assumption was that certain groups were prosecuted, and now they are in power. They will benefit from that. But apparently, after 27 years of rule by the TPLF, when TPLF lost power, what happened was the conflict targeting Tigray, where you had almost 1 million people killed. So the ultimate losers were the people of Tigray within Ethiopia. They didn't benefit from the system which was meant to benefit them. Now we have the Oromo-led kind of government, and still we have war, conflicts in Oromia. People are dying, bombed every day, and the Oromos are not getting anything out of it. We have seen that no nation or nationality, what they call it in Ethiopia, can benefit on its own unless they come together and go back to their senses. I think people are learning from what they have gone through in the last 50 years. And the hope will be for the people to come together and engage in national dialogue and solve the root causes of the conflicts in the country and find a way out. So that's where we are. I think there is hope, but that hope should come only from the people anyway, because the institutions and the elite bargaining didn't work somehow up to now.
And so the people have seen the consequences of failed ethnic federalism. And
Yes.
the hope is that they'll design a new national identity and a new national structure for Ethiopia. Let's shift gears completely. You're dialing in from California, which is where I'm from, which is the center of the universe when it comes to artificial intelligence and you name it around the globe relating to economic paradigm shifts, to political paradigm shifts, to anything that's happening nowadays. It seems that artificial intelligence is at the center of or adjacent to it or impacting it. What are your thoughts? We even talk about AI sovereignty or frontier labs operating as sovereign entities, which are impacting the global order in many different and unforeseen ways. What is your thinking on artificial intelligence? And does it give you hope for navigating this paradigm shift and for eventual positive impacts on conflict resolution and global inequality? And what impact is the fact that it's the Americans and the Chinese that control these technologies, and pretty much everybody else is a consumer rather than an originator of these technologies?
Paul, anyway, I'm not an expert on artificial intelligence, but you don't have to be. But when you see the impact, of course, affecting all of us, we see it in every aspect of our life, daily life now. It has become a reality which we cannot avoid. Again, this is also part of the historical transformation of human knowledge, know-how, and advancements which impacted humanity. Now we are talking about AI, but this before that we had different levels of advancement which we witnessed in history, from gunpowder to Telegram and Zoom, or whatever, all these different types of communication advancements, which even in our own work, Paul, had impact in a way in diplomacy, how that helped in the peace and conflicts as well. I think the question to me is whether we are discussing they are here and whether they can be stopped, but it is how we can be part of it. We can benefit from them and adapt to what situation and make them more available to the larger stakeholders in a way at the international level. But in our case, that's Africa, how Africa would benefit from this advancement. So far, what we have, at least one aspect of the AI, and you see the new weapons also being developed, like these UAVs, unmanned weapons, like drones, which what we see is their indiscriminate use in conflicts, because these are really part of the technological advances. And also the AI, to some extent, can be manipulated to the disadvantage of the people in a way who have no say in them. So the question will be, I think there are benefits. At the same time, there are challenges, but how do you regulate them? Make sure not only their availability, but also their use is in the interest of humanity, in the interest of peace and security and advancement. So that's where we are. So far, the dominating powers forces are, as you mentioned, US and China. But when you see it, I think there is a potential for others also to come around in this one. Maybe they will be more accessible to the broader community in a way. It's a very interesting area which needs much attention and focus.
Yeah, and it changes so rapidly. The ability, the capabilities of AI
Yeah.
in the economic space, the military space, you name it. Um, Drifting a little bit from this question about AI, you hinted at that AI could either reduce inequalities or exacerbate inequalities. The writ large, the paradigm shift, the global community between states and within states is quite frankly characterized by inequality and exclusion. There's some hope that AI may bridge this inequality and make it more inclusive just because of the power of the technology now with anybody with an internet connection. But even separate from AI, this paradigm shift that we're seeing when we talk about a unipolar becoming multipolar, but still talking about the great powers, the big dogs, and the middle powers fearing they're going to be left behind. Do you foresee greater inequality and greater exclusion on the global scale? Or do you see a path where this paradigm shift may actually create a more genuine and democratic global order? And I ask this because in prior podcasts, depending on who I'm talking to, the rules-based order started after World War II. When I'm talking to someone in Central and Eastern Europe, they're like, yeah, no, it didn't start until 1991. Others will say, what are you talking about? We've never had a global rules-based order for the little guys. We were just subjected to a set of rules that the big powers thought this suits our interest. Let's impose these rules on everyone else. So with that in mind, do you foresee a path where this paradigm shift might create a more democratic, fair, inclusive, and equitable arrangement among the states?
Yeah, this is a great question, a difficult question. But when you see, of course, the question of equality or inequality in history has been there from the beginning. If you see even ancient philosophers from Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, all of them, they dwelt on this issue of the equality, arguing that there has never been equality in a way, in a sense, even in those nations. Even in a small nation, you will think in one nation, there will be rich people and poor people somewhere. So the presence of that inequality always led to conflicts. The root cause of conflict, in a sense, is in the
Yeah.
inequality in a way, at all levels. And you can take it to a higher level again, interstate relations, regional uh, organization, regional states as well. I think even if you see the post-World War II global order and the establishment of the United Nations, if you see, the United Nations Charter itself, Article 2, I guess it is Article 2. The United Nations is based on the sovereign equality of its member states. But at the same time, you will sit down having the institutions set up, like the Security Council. Security Council, you will have the P5s and the non-permanent members, the P5s, with the veto power. So the very organization which is founded on the sovereign equality of nations or the member states, at the same time entertains that level of inequality in its operations, in its really very core functions of maintenance of peace and security. So what you have in law is not always what you have in real life. And it has a consequence. We have seen it. The consequence is also a perpetual complaints, conflicts, contradictions. Maybe we will see an ideal world where all are equal, but I think it's a progressive kind of advancement, revolutionary advancement, which at the end, probably with AI and other advancements, people and nations will be equals, and inequality will be probably the thing of the past. But it needs work again. I think I have somehow the belief, Paul, everything is in ourselves as individuals, as nations, as global community. I think people have to go back to their roots and start from their own, from the individual to the country, to a continent, to the global order. If we solve our own internal problems, starting from our own house and advance and work on our own development, on our betterment, then we may reach to the bigger global level equality. But unless we solve our own internal issues, internal problem at home, I think we cannot claim equality or let alone to attain it. Yeah, this is an aspiration, and I think worth aspiring for, but depends on what we do every day as individuals, as nations, as members of the global community. Yeah, but it's good to hope, I think, for the better. And the alternative will be, again, perpetual contradiction and conflicts.
Well, Berhanemeskel, I have one last question for you, which you've just answered, but let me ask it anyways, which is, what advice do you have for young professionals who are entering the field? You've had 35 years of experience, Ethiopia, the United Nations, Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau, Sudan, diplomacy, peacekeeping, and now all the work you do with PILPG as a senior peace fellow with us. You've seen a lot of changes in the world. There's going to be exponential changes going forward, but what frame of mind should young people be adopting or testing out in order to navigate their future professional growth and development?
Yeah, my hope always is in the young people. I mean, in the future, because the future belongs to the young people, and they can adapt to changes easily than the old generation. If you see now, when institutions fail, when states regress, when we see all this uncertainty at the global stage, even in the national governments, always the questioning, the resistance comes from the young population, learning from the past and charting the future in a sense. So it's always to have that an open mind more of and own the future. I think there is a lot out now, especially I think one thing which is very interesting when we talk about the AI thing is everything is in our fingertips here. You don't have to go to the library, take 2 days to read a book, but it can be summarized through the AI. And of course, it has to be verified, fact-checked, analyzed. The opportunities are there, really, to learn from what is happening. The young generations, not just the professionals who have these opportunities to go to colleges and develop, but the young generation, where we call what you and I saw in Sudan or elsewhere where we have conflicts. They are the main actors. They are the victims as well. They are the fighters. I think they have the cause they fight for in a way as players in the field in these various armed conflicts as well. And seeking jobs also in the cities where there are opportunities. They have a lot at stake than anybody else, and the opportunities are there. So a better world, I think, is better for the youth. I think there is a lot of lesson to draw from the failures and the advancements so far, which we see and learn from.
And we can use AI to summarize,
Yes,
identify and summarize those failures and advancements and lessons learned. I have high expectations for my young professionals when the new school semester starts up in the in the
Yes.
fall, given all of the resources and inspiration that's at their fingertips. So, Berhanemeskel, thank you for spending this last hour with us and sharing with us your words of wisdom that you've gathered from an amazing career and your enthusiasm and hope for the future and the role that young professionals will play in that future. So, thank you for all of the phenomenal work that you do with PILPG, that you've done over the course of your career, and for being so willing to share your thoughts and ideas with our thousands of listeners. Thank you, Berhanemeskel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, as well. I greatly appreciate what you do and what PILPG does all over the world. I know that firsthand, not just since I joined PILPG, but even in the field, working together. So there is a lot to be done, I think, to help bring peace and have a peaceful and prosperous world for all of us, for our people.
It's been a real honor and a privilege to be on that journey together with you, Berhanemeskel. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Same here. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Paul. It's a pleasure always.